All right, welcome back to our topics in cosmology. I want to introduce for our session now Greg Muller. Greg serves as a board member for Grace Abroad Ministries, who is our main host and who's put this webinar together is Grace Abroad. He holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Iowa State University, his bachelor's from Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas, also a master's certificate in biblical studies from Grace School of Theology. Greg was the pastor of a small church in East Texas for a number of years while he was in school, but he has a background in industrial automation and robotics. But interestingly, your professional career has been a lot of working with NASA as a contractor designing spacesuits. I don't know why you're not talking about that for this session.
Paul probably wanted me to.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Paul's probably done hearing about that. He wants to hear about something else, right? So today, this is really cool. I'm probably going to even mess up the pronunciation. You're talking about creation science, specifically Dendrochronology and Dispensationalism, which sounds very cool to me. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and turn it over to you. And I can't wait to listen to what you have to say.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel, and I look forward to presenting today. And so, as an engineer, I do have a broad range of interests and hobbies. So I always say I have a little bit of experience in everything, but engineering has given me the opportunity to explore and get experience in many things. But creationism has always been a topic of mine, a hobby, and the more I get into science, the more I'm certain about creation. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here and get started. So, how do Christians deal with the differences between the Bible and science? Are they really at odds? Are there actually differences? So these are some of the things that I pray we've gained some better insight in on today's conference. So continuing with that idea, I want to share a few things that deal with a biblical view of history and time, as well as a few things that deal with the naturalist view of history and time. So the overview of what I'm going to talk about here is I'll just give a little bit of background and then some of what I think is the dispensational advantages or the principles of dispensationalism, some biblical history, and then we'll get into radiodating and dendrochronology and the significance of all of this. So in the first few words of Genesis, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." A statement that to the literal Bible reader explains that the heaven and earth have not existed from all eternity, but had a beginning. Nor did they arise by emanation from an absolute substance. Instead, they were created by God. Beginning indicating the commencement of a series of things or events. But here, in this context, it gives the meaning of the very first beginning, the commencement of the world, when time itself began. The statement that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth not only precludes the idea of the eternity of the world, but it shows that the creation of the heavens and the earth was the actual beginning of all things. From the less literal reader's point of view, I've often heard argued that there is textual resources to say that God created the earth out of older material, in an attempt to explain why science, what I'll be calling naturalism, or separating from naturalism, says why naturalism says the earth is older than it is. In this verse, however, the existence of any primeval material is precluded by the object created, the heavens and the earth. This expression is frequently employed to denote the world or universe, for which there was no single word in the ancient Hebrew language. The universe consisting of a twofold whole, everything above you and everything below you. Everything. Naturalism, or what many call science, but for now I'd like to separate the term science as various methods that provide one piece of information or another, information that is then interpreted by humans. So the naturalist views science. So are the naturalist views scientific, or is science naturalist? So the naturalist views go back many hundreds of years before much of the science they claim to support in their views. That also answers an objection you often hear is there bias in the Bible believers' view of science? Well, yes, but is there bias in the naturalist view of science? Also, yes. So most naturalists talk only about the current evolutionary theory that says first life emerged at least 3.8 billion years ago. This is a page from a textbook that shows the billions of years in this scale, and how the naturalist views life evolved over a period of time. What they often don't mention about is their view that even before this 3.8 billion years, there was 750 million, almost a billion years, for that matter, that they think was before any life. Naturalism doesn't have an in the beginning. Time is eternal. Time is eternal in the naturalist view, as is at least some form of physical matter. Now, I don't want to misrepresent them. Some views in quantum physics that claim that the universe can create itself by quantum waves that go back in time and create the universe. I don't know. They're still kind of out there for me, but the basic view of the naturalist view is that at some point in there, going back in time, the material there has existed for eternity. My comment there is time must have a start, because if time doesn't have a start, there can be no now, or then, or was, or end, considering there was no beginning. So in contrast to naturalism, I believe in a literal 4-day creation about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. I say 4 days because the naturalist actually is only concerned with everything after the second 2. Their 3.8 billion years is after the second the first two years. So I don't get me wrong. I do believe in a six-day creation. But so what I wanted to talk about next here is the dispensational advantage. So in Christianity, the dispensationalists, and even more specifically, I believe, those that hold to free grace soteriology, is particularly suited to address some of these issues of science. And that's due to his or her approach, the dispensationalist approach to Scripture, with a consistent plan of salvation and addressing the text in a literal sense through the plan of salvation consistently being faith in Christ. In the Old Testament, it was the promise for the coming Messiah. And in the New Testament, we know his name as Jesus. And simple faith in him gives the believer eternal life. So a dispensation is defined in several notable books, slightly differently, but with the same to the same effect. Charles Ryrie, in his book, defines a dispensation as a distinguishable economy in the outworking of God's purpose. In the Scofield Bible, a dispensation is defined as a period of time during which man is tested in respect of obedience to some specific revelation of the will of God. And you can get into textual discussion on that, but the effect is the same. In fact, both of these authors put together a very similar set of 7 dispensations: innocence, conscience, human or civil government, promise, law, grace, and then the kingdom. And I feel those are accurate. And for the most part today, we'll be talking about the dispensation, dealing with things in the dispensation of conscience and or civil government here. Now, of course, today we're in the dispensation of grace, but and the conscience and civil government are the areas of the Bible we'll be looking at. So Ryrie, in his book on dispensationalism, states that the essence of dispensationalism is the recognition of a constant distinction between Israel and the church. And that distinction is highly important as you read through the Bible. It doesn't really come into play so much in what we're going to talk about today, but that's a very important distinction overall. In fact, some have all just summarized dispensationalism as that distinction, but there's really more to it than that. And that's the second point he makes, that a constant and regular use of a literal principle of interpretation. So that's reading the Bible and interpreting it in a consistent manner. We call it hermeneutics, or observing the text. And when you observe the text, you want to begin with an observation of the text, and then continue observing the text, and then observe more of the text. So many people don't even read the Bible, and then they suppose what it says from what they may have heard secondhand, and then decide what it means. And then if they even read the Bible, they find verses that provide the out of context view of their opinion of the text. But this is also important because the literal principle of interpretation is also important when reading things outside of the Bible, and how we approach science and literature. This is a fundamental of dispensational and a vital advantage that the dispensationalist has in any field of research. And thirdly, Ryrie discusses a basic and primary conception of the dispensationalist of the purpose of God as his own glory rather than the salvation of mankind. And that's kind of an interesting one, and probably somewhat controversial as far as what Ryrie says. But when you look at the account in Genesis, as we'll look at briefly here, it does make sense. And so much of this conference has probably focused in some way on Genesis. Likewise, in Genesis chapters 4 and 5, I would like to point out there are a couple of significant genealogies, and that that kind of gives the basis of some of the things we're discussing. But these significant genealogies shed some light on bringing glory to God, but also the cosmological differences between naturalism and creation in this portion of Genesis. So this is after the garden and before the flood. The portion that we call the dispensation is called the dispensation of conscience. So we find in chapters 4 and 5 two contrasting genealogies. The genealogy at the end of chapter 4 is genealogy through Cain, and the one in chapter 5 is through Seth. And I think a lot of people point at the distinction between these, that like Enoch was taken, and he was they try to make some typology reference to it. Seventh from Adam, Enoch was not. He was, so God loved him so much, God took him without him dying. Whereas the seventh from Adam, through Cain, was Lamech, who built a city in his name, and which wasn't a good guy. So that's normally what I'll hear when these two genealogies are discussed. But one of the things that's really noticeable is when you read these passages, you'll notice that Cain was cursed by God for killing Abel. And so Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. And we read that in Genesis 4:16. And while there are 7 generations of Cain recorded, you'll notice the one thing that's distinctively missing is no ages are given. And there's no record of his age when any of these events happened. You don't know how old he was when his children were born or any of that. And that's distinctive compared to the lineage of Seth. Now you can surmise that he was probably less than 130, because that was Adam's age when his younger brother was born. But these lack of ages in his line show no future history. So in Seth, we have the line in Genesis 5 that from Enosh or Enos, depending on which translation you use, you'll see that in Seth's line, at that point, the men began to call on the name of the Lord. So again, in Cain, you find no future history, but in Seth, you find the men calling on the name of the Lord. So from Adam on, we read in chapter 5 that Adam was created in the image of God, and so he begot or bore children in his own likeness after his image. He transmitted that image of God in which he was created. Not necessarily in purity, but in form. The birth of the Son, by whom the line and the promise of the seed is perpetuated, and it is followed by an account of the number of years that Adam and each of the other fathers lived after that, by the statement that each one bore other sons and daughters, and then the number of years he lived, and lastly, the assertion that he died. So the assertion that he died may seem superfluous, but it's intended to indicate by its context that death reigned from Adam downwards as an unchangeable law. See Romans for that. But this background of universal death, the power of life, and the faithfulness of the promise was still more conspicuous. Men did not die till he had propagated life. So in the midst of death of individuals, the life of the race was preserved and the hope of the seed sustained, by which the author of death should be overcome. So we see a similar record in the line of Noah. And not only that, this line from Seth continues through the flood. As I had said earlier, this record is of the future history of the promise. So these genealogies give us a chronology of the early Earth over 2,000 years, just between these two passages, with the flood in between them two. So you have the dispensation of conscience in Genesis 5, just the dispensation of civil government in Genesis chapter 11. In between, you have the dispensation of water, or dispenser of water. But I'm confident in this story of Genesis, and the evidence here is that the earth is young because of several reasons. One specifically is this story of the flood in Genesis 7. Genesis 7 takes place about 1,600 years ago, 1,600 years after Genesis, the beginning, and about 5,000 years approximately before today, according to the text of the Bible and recorded history. So, as I said, these genealogies give us a chronology, and when you add these together, you get get the 1,600 years from creation. And so that's in contrast, and what I was saying earlier about 4 days and 2 days bring us approximately 6,100 years total to the present. A few pieces of data to back that up, and moving toward the dendrochronology discussion. Water-based animals and shells found everywhere on the earth, from the top of mountains to every national park in the United States. And in fact, if you visit these parks, you'll find something that I've always, as I've visited parks over the years, I've always noticed something that reads to the effect of, this region was once an inland lake or sea, and they can't explain what they find any other way from the naturalist worldview. And so, why have I decided to take a look at dendrochronology here? The first thing is, let's define dendrochronology. It's the study of data from the tree ring growth. This is a scientific method of dating tree rings to the exact year they were formed. This can give data for climatology during different periods in the world, in history from the wood. So one well-known place that fossils actually are trees is the Petrified Forest Natural Park. Now, the dendrochronologist is going to probably point out right here and say, oh, well, these are fossils, not trees. And that's true. The dendrochronologists actually require real wood, and this is just one of those things that really got me thinking about dendrochronology. It was when I was back in high school. I can remember visiting these national parks, and the Petrified Forest in Arizona was one of them. And it got me curious if these trees had rings, and if one could know how old they were when they fell or when they died. And I was actually quite disappointed to find out that the internal structure of these trees was not preserved. So these trees' age can't be determined. And actually, according to the National Park Service's information, they're even subtropical trees. So because of that, they're not actually growth rings. And so whether or not the internal structure was preserved or not was kind of irrelevant. And then another interesting thing is petrified palmwood. It's the state stone of Texas, actually. So Texas designated petrified palmwood as the state stone in 1969. And again, it's actually a fossil, not a stone, which people have laughed at Texas for having a stone that's actually a fossil as their stone. But petrified palmwood comes from trees between, according to the naturalist, 20 to 40 million years ago, give or take a few years. And again, we can't get years it was alive because of no growth rings, and that's just due to the palmwood structure. They're not the annual growth rings. But there's tons of it. And then another lesser known place that I just happened to cross accidentally on a trip is called the Fluorescent Fossil Beds National Monument in Colorado. So the fluorescent fossil beds contains multiple fossilized stumps as well as other things, but they're redwood stump trees that they have unearthed that are completely fossilized. And they, of course, say that they're millions of years ago old, but the interesting thing to me as a creationist is they have at most about 1,000 rings. And that would be consistent with a pre-flood timeline. So what really got, this petrified wood, it's everywhere. It's even the kitchen sink. The creationists see these fossils as evidence of the flood. This was kind of funny. There's literally so much petrified wood out there that you can have a kitchen sink made out of it. Not even kidding. My in-laws have one. It's actually in a bathroom, but yeah, it's everywhere. So the term dendrochronology actually was brought up in the debate that's now infamous between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. And I remember this image particularly. I think this was about 6 or 7 years ago, where Bill Nye is criticizing Ken Ham for his views because of there being trees that are older than what creationists or young Earth creationists believe that the world is. And living trees that he claimed were 6,800 years old or almost 10,000 years old at 9,550 years. I actually got to go to a conference myself where Bill Nye was speaking last fall, and the picture in the upper right was one I took. So got to meet Bill Nye there, and didn't really get to talk to him, but did snap a picture of him on stage. So back when I was working on my master's degree, so to answer the question of these old trees, back when I was working on my master's degree, I had the opportunity to take an elective, and one elective particularly caught my eye, and it was nuclear radiation and engineering. It was a very interesting and informative course. And also why I always refer to going through the backscatter machines at the airport as getting an X-ray. I really thought learning about how to derive the classical equation E equals mc squared from particle equation was fun for math nerds out there. In a later chapter of the textbook, while learning about radioactive decay, the topic of radiodating was presented, which sounds like an antiquated process because everyone knows you date online these days. It's not through the radio. I'm just kidding. But really, radiodating was something that I had heard about for many years in apologetics books, usually referred to as radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is mentioned even in the book that Paul Miles edited on the dispensationalism. A number of times by both of the authors in their essays on the age of the Earth. So we can find the principle, or define the principle of radiodating as measuring the daughter particle, or the daughter and parent concentrations in a specimen, allowing us to determine the age. So if at the time a sample was created, a known number of radioactive atoms of the same type was incorporated, the sample age, or the time, is readily found from the remaining atoms and the radioactive decay law. Unfortunately, we never know the initial number of atoms. So this principle, the contained within this idea, is very reliable from the half-life of the atoms, but to extend it to something like trees, it requires several assumptions. Sometimes in this process, the initial ratio of the radionuclei and the stable isotope of the same element can be estimated. This ratio equation is here on the screen. The most common dating method that uses this approach is the carbon-14 dating method. And this carbon-14 undergoes beta decay by losing an electron and an antineutrino. And it's kind of a cycle because it's created or formed by nitrogen getting hit by cosmic rays and then splitting in nitrogen into carbon-14. And this interaction in the atmosphere, it takes nitrogen and forms the carbon-14. And so you have several different types of stable carbon in the atmosphere. 99% is the normal carbon-12, but there's also the carbon-13 and carbon-14. And carbon-14 is just a very, very small percentage, 1 part per trillion. And the half-life, because it's a radioactive element that has a half-life, is right now shown to be 5,730 years. That constant actually has changed over the last 70 years. I mean, considering nuclear science is under 100 years old, that has changed just a few times, but that's probably pretty reliable. So the carbon-14 and how it gets into materials, it reacts with oxygen in the atmosphere to form carbon dioxide, and then enters the carbon cycle, and through photosynthesis to glucose, and then it's processed by the plants and the animals into their structure as cellulose. And this is high school science. So the carbon-14 in its even in its radioactive isotope, it acts as a carbon. So it processes through that typical carbon cycle. So we come to how these trees were dated. Now, Bill Nye mentioned 2 trees. He mentioned this old Tijoko, I believe is the way it's pronounced, as 9,500 years. That one's completely dated by carbon dating. There's not tree rings in that one. It's called a colonial tree, and so it doesn't have a long life cycle of the main stem. They take samples of what they consider to be old portions of the root and then date those, and then come to a conclusion about the colonial tree's age. So that one's kind of weird, but the 6,800-year-old tree, that's a bristlecone pine that he shows there. And so that really piqued my interest. And the bristlecone pine is really what they kind of calibrate a lot of things upon. And so in this discussion on dendrochronology, you'll find that the oldest tree by itself is, just by looking at its age, as in living age tree rings count back, was 4,789 years. And that was in about 1968. So you can do that math. And 1957. That was what I put down in my slide. I think the results weren't published until about 10 years later. It took them 10 years to count the rings or something. And so this Edward Schulman, which is actually pictured here, drilling into a smaller tree, and that one actually is supposed to be 700 years old, according to this National Geographic article. So he's drilling into this tree to take a core sample, which is showed on the right here, and then they count the number of rings and determine how old it is. And they need to know exactly when that first ring is, or at least they used to, in order to calibrate the remaining rings. So the interesting thing is that these longer timelines, such as the one Bill Nye mentioned, are from dead samples, or what they call floating segments, found in the mountains near these big forests of bristlecone pines that have been just laying in there or not rotting for thousands of years. Now, I mean, some of them are still, standing in the trees and just haven't rotted. They argue that they don't rot like a typical piece of wood, that in that 3,000 feet altitude that the mountains are, and it's very arid, that they weather more like rocks. I guess I have some questions there, but that's what they claim, and then they compare the rings to make a longer timeline. And even in some of their data published even this year, they point out that, Methuselah fits the creationist chronology, but the creationist has to discard the older remnants, or that's the argument. And I honestly not sure what to do with that, because the rings are very small, and they say even as small as one cell, and they can't always match them consistently. But I guess I take hope and heart in the fact that the oldest tree samples aren't beyond that kind of biblical range for the chronology. So the archaeologists like to ask, who owns time? And there are many points of contention among the dendrochronologists. So in asking who owns time, the original discoverer of this process was Liddy and his carbon dating system. In the 1960s, he actually got a Nobel Prize in physics for that, and mostly because he'd taken a piece of Zozer's coffin, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, and radiodated it with some with his process, and came out with something that was within a few hundred years of what it was believed to be through, just historical data. So, however, some of the earlier Egyptian artifacts also contradict the dates from these other reliable sources. So, all throughout all of these data sources, we find that science can't wait for a calibration curve, and they're continuing to shift dates hundreds or thousands of years back and forth. And so they've developed numerous data curves through this process of dating the trees. And that's by analyzing the carbon that's in various segments of the tree to create a calibration curve. And as I mentioned earlier, there's several big assumptions that have to be made in this process. The biggest one is probably the initial concentration of the atoms. Now, the creationists will point out that with the flood, that's going to play a great big either dip or spike or move there's an anomaly at the point of the flood about the assumption of what the radioactivity due to the carbon-14 process is here. And there's also the assumption that the samples with 0 carbon-14 are older than 10 half-lives. Again, the creationists with the understanding of the flood, there's an anomaly. Was there carbon-14 before the flood? We don't know. I know Paul's talked about the expanse. There was something different about the atmosphere. We know the rainbow after the flood was unique. It wasn't something that happened before the flood. Did the atmosphere change? That's the assumption that they make, is if there was something in the atmosphere that prevented carbon-14 being formed by cosmic rays then before the flood, then the samples with 0 carbon-14 may not be accurate as 10 half-lives, so 50,000 years. So assumptions about the sun cycles, fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. Even in their literature, they talk about the Earth's magnetic field. It means that the carbon clock can race ahead or seemingly stop for up to 5 centuries. The physiology of the plants and animals being dated. What exactly is this? The process of the physiology. There's a great deal of physiology studies that need to be done on the things being dated. And then the specimen of whatever is being tested had not gained or lost any carbon since it died. Contamination. That's what you're dealing with, such small amounts of carbon. A little bit of contamination can go a long way. And this is, again, an article published this year, not a creation article. This is a secular article, or a naturalist article. Many people tend to think that a radiocarbon curve is set in stone, that once you get a date, you can trust it completely. But the curve has been revised many times. Bristle cones have been crucial to that process. Those who study sea level fluctuations during and after the last ice age This is data used to model patterns of global warming, as they say these days, rely almost entirely on carbon dating. And that carbon dating is directly related to these tree rings. So in conclusion, we can see that the constant and regular use of a literal principle of interpretation in understanding all of these assumptions that are made can help the naturalist come to a better understanding of their conclusions, and that there isn't a complete conclusion on these things yet. That's what astounds me in even these scientific literature articles. They don't know. They don't know if their assumptions are right, and I give them credit when they say it. And I quoted a couple of them in here. I give them credit when they say it because it's honest. But then they go and fault the creationists for saying, well, I still believe that the Earth is younger than you're saying. So we shouldn't just accept the naturalist's conclusions. We've seen that the conclusions are drawn from the science are constantly changing. And additionally, the science itself isn't contradictory to the Bible. It's the interpretation of the science that is said to be contradictory to the Bible. The biblical account shines out as an unchanging and reliable source of knowing God and reason for faith in Jesus, as well as the many things we can learn about interpreting science from its pages. So I've reached the end of my presentation. Hopefully I'm within my time slot here.
Yeah, you're good. So the expert portion of the show where we examine those three little words, I don't know. So for everybody who had questions, I think he just answered those.
I will attempt to answer. There's a lot of rabbit trails you can take.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, it's been several years since high school biology and earth science and that sort of thing. So I was digging back into my brain thinking, you know, what was it that I was taught? I went to a Christian school, and so we came at it from a Christian perspective. And you repeated some of those things, like the carbon dating. I heard that carbon dating has a narrow field in which you can actually get accurate time frame. How far back can carbon dating, especially now, you've mentioned that half-lives have changed and all sorts of things. How far back is carbon dating actually reliable?
They are, I would say it's reliable approximately 3,000 years.
Really?
Yes.
So you were talking about 10 half-lives and 50,000 years. 50,000, much less millions or billions, is a long way compared to 3,000. So, what's the significance there?
Exactly right. And that's kind of one of the things that I kind of marvel about in the naturalist point of view, is that they're taking a very small period of time to extrapolate way beyond what would be significant, and so yeah, there's carbon dating is really just one type of radiometric dating. There's several others. So they have a quote unquote calibration curve that goes back 50,000 years. They're trying to get that officially put in. It's actually a combination of bristlecone pine, coral, as well as oaks from from England that are in bogs that are supposed to be older.
So if the oldest tree that we can date is, you said 4,500 or in that range, right? 4,500 or so, and an accurate carbon dating is only about 3,000, then you're telling me that if I go out and find a tree and I count its rings, I might actually be more accurate than carbon dating.
It's possible. But I mean, again, I don't want to mischaracterize their point of view. Their point of view is that they have data that goes back farther. Yeah. I think when you look at how many samples of their older comparison, because that's how this is calibrated, through comparison. They have very few samples going back beyond about 3,000 years, and that's just because there's not that many trees. You have the sequoias that are about 3,000 years old, and then you have these bristlecone pines that are about under 5,000 years old. And that's not even getting into there's a lot of people that do research on, do these trees produce multiple rings when they're younger? And I think that is a possibility. I didn't really put it out there as a main point, but it is a possibility because we're seeing these when they have 5,000 rings on them. What were they doing in those first 2,000 when the tree was young? And because they would be much more susceptible to fluctuations in the climate. And these trees at 3,000 feet, they're going through freeze-thaw cycles year-round, and those freeze-thaw cycles are what can contribute to multiple rings. So if they're going through 100 freeze-thaw cycles in a year, how many rings are they actually producing in that year? Again, that's not nothing you can conclusively prove, but that's one of the discussions that's out there.
Well, we see today,
which would change their age, which would greatly change their age, and as well as these calibration curves that they're using to date anything from, pottery that's found in a cave to, the tombs in the pyramids. So.
Right, the pharaohs, right? A tree falls today and no one hears it and it still dies, right? So, but it doesn't fossilize. It rots, it decays, and goes into the ground.
Yeah.
So to have a fossilization or a petrification of this wood, I would think, and I think your position is that it does require some kind of catastrophic event. We see Mount St. Helens, we see the flood, whatever. It's not something that happens every day.
Right. And where I would say all of this wood is about 5,000 years old, that is fossilized. They claim it's millennia.
Okay, good. Well, this was fascinating. This was it was almost brain hurting. You did it with you're rolling this stuff out, and I'm like, holy cow, he knows all this stuff just like off the top of his head, and I'm trying to dig back into high school. And so this is fascinating. This was fantastic. I really appreciate your time, and that you would share some of your expertise with us and really get us thinking about how the Bible, we can see these things, like you said, the flood and the ages, just with the science that we're doing today. I think that's really cool. And thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Daniel.
So we're going to take a quick break and then come back with our final 3 sessions, Science in Genesis, parts 1, 2, and 3. So thank you. If you have questions, you can put them in the Facebook, and we'll get them over to Greg, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer anything that you still have outstanding. All right, see you in a bit.